Welcome to Terrifying Exorcism. Tonight we uncover one of the scariest cases ever. A cursed house in Belmez, Spain, where digging beneath the floor revealed coffin nails, human hair, and a darkness that would not stay buried. Before we begin, what time is it where you're watching? And where in the world are you joining us from tonight? This isn't just possession. It's a battle with a horror that waits beneath the earth, patient and unforgiving. Are you ready to see what was unearthed beneath the Belmez house? I am a reporter, and though I've investigated countless strange events, I can say without hesitation that what I'm about to recount remains the most disturbing case I ever came across. I first learned of it while speaking with Father Manuel Ruiz, a priest whose weary voice carried the weight of experiences no man should have to bear. It was Spain, 1971. The town was Belmez de la Moraleda, a quiet, rural place that had long lived in obscurity. Farmers tended to their land, children played in dusty courtyards, and families gathered under tiled roofs that had seen generations pass. But beneath one particular house, something old had been waiting, something buried not just in soil, but in silence. The case began with a girl, Maria Gomez, 23 years old. She was shy, soft-spoken, and lived with her mother and younger brother. Those who knew her described her as devout, often seen attending Mass quietly, never drawing attention. Yet her life changed in a way that would mark the entire village with fear. The first sign was the floor. Her mother had been cooking when she saw it, a faint shape pressing through the cement of their kitchen, almost like moisture rising but darker, sharper. By the following morning it had formed the clear outline of a human face, sunken eyes, a mouth caught mid-cry. Neighbors crowded in, whispering about blasphemy and curses, but Maria stood in the corner, pale, unable to look away. Father Ruiz told me that the church at first dismissed it as nonsense. Moisture, shadows, paint, anything but what the people feared, he recalled. But the fear in the villagers grew. And then Maria began to change. She stopped eating. At night, she woke screaming, claiming she heard nails scraping under the floor, like someone locked beneath the cement was clawing upward. Her brother swore he heard it too, though no one else did. Soon Maria developed violent migraines that left her convulsing on her bed. Doctors came from nearby towns, diagnosing hysteria, migraines, even epilepsy. They prescribed medication, but nothing eased her suffering. I asked Father Ruiz how he became involved. He said a family member, desperate, came to the parish and begged for help. At first, he refused. I am not quick to declare demons where illness may exist, he told me. But when he entered the house, the air was heavy, acrid, as though the very walls had absorbed grief. The smell of burnt hair clung to the corners, though no fire had been lit. He described seeing Maria, frail, sunken-eyed, her lips muttering words in a dialect she could not have known. The family's fear grew after an incident one night. They awoke to a deafening crash in the kitchen. When they rushed down, they found the table overturned, plates shattered, and the face on the floor changed, twisted now into a snarl, its mouth wide as if screaming. Maria stood barefoot in the center of the room, her nails bloodied from scratching the concrete. It was then, Father Ruiz told me, that he felt certain something beyond human explanation was at work. Yet the cause, the why, was not clear. Some neighbors insisted the family destroy the floor entirely to rid the house of its blasphemous markings. The mother resisted, afraid, but eventually she agreed. Men with pickaxes came. They chipped at the cement, breaking into the earth beneath. The sound of iron on stone echoed through the house, and with each strike Maria grew restless, pacing, muttering, clutching her head. Then they reached what was buried. Coffin nails, bundles of human hair, darkened with age, bones, fragmented and worn, some still with jagged ends where flesh had once clung. The men froze, whispering that graves had been disturbed, that someone, long ago, had buried the remnants of the dead beneath the home. Father Ruiz leaned close to me when he recounted this part, his voice low. I could not ignore it after that, he said. The girl's suffering, the faces on the floor, the relics buried in secret. This was desecration, and desecration invites darkness. Maria's symptoms worsened after the discovery. She refused to sleep in the house, claiming hands pulled at her from the bed. She woke with scratches across her chest, though her nails were cut to the quick. At times her voice changed, harsh, guttural, mocking her mother's prayers with blasphemies that made even the strongest men leave the room in shame. Still, the church hesitated. The bishop demanded more proof, Father Ruiz told me bitterly. Proof, as if the devil makes himself available for inspection. The family pleaded, but officials feared scandal. They labeled it superstition, urging the family to consult physicians again. Doctors came again and again. They brought sedatives, examinations, even whispered of committing Maria to an asylum in Granada. But the girl's condition defied them. Her body weakened, yet her outbursts grew violent. Once, 3 men struggled to hold her as she screamed in a voice that was not her own. Her words chilled them. She accused one man of sins he had never confessed publicly. He left the house and never returned. I asked Father Ruiz what he felt in those moments. As he watched the girl break apart, he paused for a long time before answering. "Helpless," he said. "I had read of such things, but I had never seen them. You feel faith tested, not in God, but in your own ability to serve him." The villagers were divided. Some avoided the family entirely, fearing contagion of evil. Others whispered that the Gomez home had been cursed for generations. Old records suggested that the land once held unmarked graves from centuries past, victims of plague or forgotten executions. Whether truth or rumor, the stories spread like fire. The turning point came one winter night. The family claimed they heard pounding from beneath the floor again, not faint but thunderous, shaking the walls. Maria collapsed, seizing violently, her body arching off the bed in unnatural angles. Her brother swore her eyes turned black. Her mother screamed for the priest. Father Ruiz arrived to find the girl unconscious, her lips moving silently as though in prayer. But the words were inverted, a parody of the Lord's Prayer spoken backward. The floor beneath her bed had darkened with a new stain, the outline of another face, this one smaller like that of a child. That was when I knew, he told me, his eyes weary. We could no longer deny her. This was possession. But recognition did not mean action. The church moved slowly, bound by caution and fear of ridicule. Papers began to circulate rumors of faces on the floor in Belmez, dismissing them as trickery, paint, or illusions. Meanwhile, Maria weakened day by day. I will not soon forget what Father Ruiz said as our conversation drew to a close that night. He looked past me, as though seeing the kitchen floor again, and whispered, "I dug under that house myself. I saw the nails, the hair, the bones. The devil does not need fire and brimstone. Sometimes he waits in silence, buried beneath your feet, until someone gives him air. And that, he said, was only the beginning." The father's last words still echoed in my mind. Sometimes he waits in silence, buried beneath your feet until someone gives him air. From that point forward, his account grew darker. The excavation of the floor had not brought closure. It had opened something. In the weeks that followed, the Gomez household fell into despair. The family sealed off the kitchen, placing planks of wood over the ground so no one would have to look at the faces pressed into the cement. But closing doors did little to stop the phenomena. Neighbors began hearing strange sounds from outside the house at night, muffled cries, low wailing, sometimes a pounding like fists striking from within the walls. Some villagers swore they saw flickering lights in the windows when no lamps burned. The house, once a place of quiet meals and family prayers, became a place of dread. Maria, meanwhile, grew weaker. The young woman who had once tended to her brother and helped her mother with the house now spent most of her days in bed. She muttered phrases in a language her family could not identify, guttural, ancient-sounding, yet spoken fluently, as if she had known it her entire life. Doctors returned this time from Granada, carrying medical instruments and a tone of skepticism. They examined Maria thoroughly, recording notes, prescribing sedatives. One physician even accused the family of encouraging hysteria, suggesting the girl had learned the behavior from books or rumors spreading in the town. But when one of the doctors leaned close to inspect Maria's pupils, she whispered his dead father's name. He froze, She repeated details from the man's past, things that had never been public, things even his colleagues did not know. He left the room pale, refusing to return. It was then, Father Ruiz told me, that I knew we were past the reach of medicine. The church, however, was not easily swayed. Bishop Ortega demanded restraint. "We must not rush to label demons where sin or sickness suffice," he wrote in a letter. The church had long feared scandal, and cases of supposed possession often attracted ridicule from the press. But the Gomez family's pleas were growing desperate. They had nowhere else to turn. Father Ruiz described his first attempt at private intervention. He did not perform a full rite. Permission had not been granted. But he brought holy water and prayer to Maria's bedside. He sprinkled the water across her forehead. At once, her body stiffened and her eyes snapped open. The water left welts upon her skin, red and blistered. She shrieked in a voice that was not her own, mocking the priest in words of obscene cruelty. "She called me by my childhood nickname," he admitted quietly, his face tightening as though reliving the shame. "No one alive knew it. No one." That night, the priest could not sleep. He sat in the rectory, replaying her words, the guttural laugh that followed. He confessed to me that he questioned his vocation. "If such knowledge is possible to the devil, then where does that leave us? Are we defenseless?" But he returned. Again and again he went back to that house, unable to abandon the family even as his faith trembled. The villagers grew restless too. Rumors of the faces in the floor spread beyond Belmez. Outsiders began to arrive, some out of curiosity, others to mock. The family, humiliated and exhausted, closed their doors to strangers. The mother feared that the attention only fed whatever force plagued them. One evening, while the town was preparing for Mass, the Gomez brother burst into the church, shouting that Maria was being attacked. Father Ruiz rushed to the house. He found her sprawled on the floor, her body convulsing violently. Around her were scattered clumps of her own hair, torn from her scalp as though pulled out in a frenzy. The floor beneath her was damp, not with blood, but with a foul-smelling liquid no one could identify. "She should not have been alive after that seizure," the priest said to me. Her body bent backward until her spine should have broken. Yet she lived, gasping, her lips murmuring prayers backward, reversing the words of faith. By now the cause of her torment seemed clear to those who believed. The excavation had disturbed the dead. Old villagers whispered that the land had once been cursed, a place of unholy burials. Some suggested executions from centuries before, others claimed suicides denied Christian burial. Whatever the truth, something buried had been given a voice. The bishop finally agreed to investigate. 2 priests arrived, instructed not to speak publicly of their findings. They met Maria, observed her state, and questioned the family. The priests left shaken but cautious. They wrote that, while disturbances exist, it is premature to declare possession. The hesitation broke the family's resolve. The mother begged Father Ruiz, "If you will not help her, then she will die." And so, against official orders, he began preparations. He studied old texts on exorcism, revisiting words he had never expected to use. He fasted for 3 days, spending nights in prayer. He sought guidance from an elder priest, one of his teachers, who warned him that facing such darkness could cost him more than his health. "The devil is patient," the elder priest said. "He will not simply leave because you command it. He will search your weakness and he will strike it." On the night of the first attempt, the air in the Gomez home was heavy, suffocating. Neighbors gathered outside, clutching rosaries, afraid to enter but unwilling to leave. Inside, candles flickered, though no draught stirred. Maria lay upon the bed, restrained by cloth, her wrists already bruised from earlier struggles. Father Ruiz began with the opening prayers. His voice shook at first, but steadied as he continued. The girl responded by spitting, her saliva dark and foul-smelling. She laughed in tones that shifted, first her own, then her brother's, then voices no one recognized. The holy water hissed upon her skin as though poured upon fire. She screamed, thrashing, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. The family sobbed nearby, torn between hope and terror. Then the house itself seemed to join in. A pounding began beneath the floorboards, steady like fists striking from below. The planks rattled. Dishes crashed from shelves. One neighbor swore he saw shadows moving across the walls, though the candles burned still. But the priest pressed on, invoking the name of Christ, demanding the presence to reveal itself. Maria convulsed violently, her mouth opening wider than seemed possible. A guttural roar burst forth, shaking the room. And then silence. For a brief moment, all was still. The candles flickered, then steadied. The family dared to hope. But as the priest approached her, Maria's eyes opened. They were not her own. She smiled, and in a voice low and cold, she whispered, Those three words, spoken in that guttural voice from Maria's lips, froze the room. Father Ruiz told me he felt the blood drain from his body in that instant. He had read accounts of such declarations in ancient texts, but to hear it in person, from the mouth of a girl he had baptized as a child, was something entirely different. Her mother screamed and clutched her rosary tighter, pressing it so hard into her palms that the beads left marks in her skin. Her brother tried to lunge forward, but the priest ordered him back, fearing that the entity would use the boy's desperation against him. Ruiz began again, forcing his voice steady. In the name of the Lord, leave her. Maria's body arched upward, straining against the cloth restraints. Her face contorted into something unrecognizable, lips pulled wide, eyes blackened with swollen veins. She laughed, the sound sharp and mocking, echoing off the walls of the small home. The pounding from beneath the floor resumed, louder than before. The planks vibrated, dust sifting from the ceiling as if the entire house might collapse. The family shouted prayers through tears. Still, Ruiz kept reading, his words deliberate, unwavering despite his own terror. At one point, Maria stopped thrashing and lay still. Her chest rose and fell slowly, her eyes closing. For a moment it seemed as if she had been released. Her mother wept with relief, whispering thanks. But then Maria's lips moved again, quietly, almost tenderly. Manuel. The priest froze. No one in the room had ever called him by his first name. He hadn't told the family. The entity was speaking directly to him. You doubt, it said. You always have. He admitted later that the words pierced him more deeply than any scream or blasphemy. The thing inside Maria was not merely resisting prayer, it was searching him, pulling at the fractures in his faith. For the first time he faltered. His voice broke, the Latin stumbling on his tongue. Maria's body jerked violently upward. Her restraints snapped, the cloth tearing as though it had been cut. She leapt from the bed with unnatural force, knocking her brother to the ground. Her hands clawed at the priest's cassock, her nails tearing fabric. Her face hovered inches from his, her breath sour and hot, whispering, You are weaker than me. Her mother screamed, pulling her back, while Ruiz shoved her away with desperate strength. He grabbed the crucifix from his chest and pressed it against her forehead. For a brief second, a sizzling sound filled the room, and Maria shrieked with such ferocity that neighbors outside dropped to their knees, covering their ears. Then she collapsed. The priest knelt beside her, trembling, unsure whether she was dead or unconscious. Her skin was pale, lips cracked and bleeding, but her chest rose and fell weakly. Ruiz knew the battle had not been won, only delayed. That night, he did not return to the rectory. He remained in the Gomez home, sitting near Maria's bed as she slept fitfully, whispering in her dreams. He prayed silently, but doubts consumed him. If the entity could see into him, exploit his weakness, then how could he hope to prevail? In the morning, the bishop's men arrived. They had heard of the disturbance, though rumors traveled faster than truth. They entered the house, inspected the girl, and spoke quietly with the family. Their verdict was disheartening. This is not possession, but illness complicated by hysteria. The mother nearly collapsed in despair. The bishop's representatives instructed Ruiz to stand down, to cease any further rites without permission. The family was to return Maria to medical care. But as they left, one of the priests, a younger man, lingered. He approached Ruiz quietly and murmured, I believe you, I have seen this once before. Then, without another word, he followed his superior out. For days, Maria remained in a state of half-consciousness. She would sleep for hours, then wake suddenly to scream obscenities. At times her voice would change mid-sentence, slipping from her own into deep, masculine tones. The house seemed to rot with her. Food spoiled quickly, water turned foul, and animals refused to enter the yard. Her brother confessed to Ruiz that he sometimes heard whispering at night, voices calling his name from beneath the floorboards. Once, he claimed, he awoke to find strands of hair spread across his pillow, not his own, but the same blackened, brittle hair that had been dug up weeks before. The priest tried to comfort him, but the boy's eyes told him there was little hope left. I asked Ruiz whether he considered abandoning the case altogether. He shook his head firmly. No, I was afraid, yes, but walking away would have been worse. To leave her was to hand her over. He sought advice from his former teacher, an elderly priest named Father Santiago, who had once assisted in a possession case decades earlier. Santiago listened quietly, his face lined with concern. You must not face this alone, he told Ruiz. This is not only the girl's trial, it is your own. The enemy seeks to destroy your faith first so that you cannot fight for hers. Santiago offered to join him, but age and frailty kept him from enduring long hours of prayer. Still, his words carried weight. Ruiz returned to Belmez with renewed determination, even as dread gnawed at him. The turning point came one night in late autumn. The Gomez mother reported that Maria had begun speaking in multiple voices, sometimes her own, sometimes others entirely. During one episode, she cried out in the voice of a local man who had died years earlier, describing his burial in unsettling detail. Another time, she mimicked the bishop himself, repeating words he had spoken in private. The family begged Ruiz to resume the rite, and though he knew he risked defying his superiors, he agreed. The second attempt was more deliberate. Ruiz fasted again, and this time he asked the villagers to keep vigil outside, praying silently through the night. Inside the home, candles were lit in every room, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Maria was restrained more firmly, though her frail body seemed too weak to resist. Ruiz began with prayers of protection, invoking the saints, the Virgin, the Archangel Michael. He described to me how the atmosphere in the room thickened, the air heavy as though pressing down on his lungs. Maria stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and a smile spread across her face, slow, deliberate, knowing. "You came back," she whispered. "I was waiting." The voice was not hers. Her body convulsed as he sprinkled holy water. She screamed, but the scream layered upon itself, as if multiple throats cried out at once. Her mother wept openly, clinging to the bed frame, whispering prayers between sobs. Ruiz continued, louder now, commanding the presence to leave. The girl thrashed violently, her head striking the wood so hard that blood trickled down her temple. The restraints groaned under her weight, but held. Then suddenly she went still. Her eyes turned upward, focusing on something unseen above her, and in a voice filled with mockery she recited scripture. Perfectly, word for word, but inverted, the passages twisted into blasphemy. The villagers outside heard it through the walls. Some fled, covering their ears. Others dropped to their knees in fear. Ruiz pressed on, sweat pouring down his face, his voice raw from shouting the prayers. At last, Maria shrieked one final time, a cry so piercing that it rattled the windows. Her body collapsed, limp, and silence fell. The priest dared not assume victory. He leaned close, pressing the crucifix against her chest. She did not react. Her breathing steadied, though faintly. Her eyes remained closed. The family rejoiced, thinking the nightmare over. Her mother kissed Ruiz's hand, thanking him through tears. But Ruiz, with heavy certainty, told them, "It is not finished. This was only the first battle. Whatever holds her, it has not left." And he was right. The next morning, when the villagers gathered to hear news, Maria's mother announced with trembling hope that her daughter was resting peacefully. But as she spoke, a sudden crash erupted from the house. The family rushed inside to find Maria standing barefoot in the kitchen, staring down at the floor. A new face had appeared in the cement, this one more twisted than the rest, its eyes hollow, its mouth torn wide in a scream. Maria's hands were pressed to it, her fingers smeared with blood. And in a whisper only Ruiz could hear, she said, He told me his name. When Maria whispered those words, Father Ruiz felt a coldness spread through him that no candle could warm. He leaned in cautiously, his crucifix still clutched tight, and asked what name she had heard. Maria did not answer immediately. She swayed in place, her bloody fingertips grazing the cement where the new face had formed. The expression etched into the floor was grotesque, twisted as though caught mid-scream. Finally, in a voice barely her own, she whispered, "Aquel que espera," the one who waits. Her mother gasped, crossing herself. Her brother backed away in terror. Ruiz told me he had heard of such phrases in older records, names not spoken outright but cloaked in titles, fragments meant to conceal or misdirect. Demons, he explained, rarely gave their true names. Instead, they offered riddles, symbols, or mockeries of scripture. The entity's choice chilled him more than if it had screamed blasphemies. Waiting implied patience, and patience meant intention. That night, Ruiz insisted that Maria not be left alone. He remained in the house, moving between restless prayer and silent listening. Every creak of the floor, every breath from the girl's restless sleep carried weight. Around midnight, the boy shook him awake, whispering frantically that he heard voices under the planks again. Ruiz pressed his ear to the floor. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then came a faint sound, a scratching, rhythmic, deliberate. Not the wild clawing they had described before, but something slower, methodical, like nails drawn carefully against stone. He pulled back, unsettled. The boy stared at him, wide-eyed. "You heard it too, Father?" Ruiz did not answer. By dawn, Maria had worsened again. Her skin was pallid, her lips cracked, and she refused food or water. At intervals, she muttered fragments of the same phrase, "the one who waits." Ruiz tried to press her for more, but her eyes would glaze over, and she seemed to drift into some inner void, unreachable. The family begged him to begin the full exorcism rite. He hesitated. Without official sanction, he risked not only his standing in the church, but his very soul. Yet, to delay felt like abandonment. His conscience tore between obedience and the desperate pleas of a mother. He sought counsel again from Father Santiago. The elder priest listened with a solemn expression, then said softly, "You already know your path, Manuel. The question is not whether you will do it, but whether your faith is strong enough to endure." Ruiz left Santiago with a mixture of dread and determination. He decided that if the bishop refused again, he would act in secret. Days passed with Maria's condition deteriorating. The family grew haggard, unable to sleep for fear of what might happen in the night. The brother confessed to Ruiz that he sometimes awoke to find Maria staring at him from across the room, her eyes black in the candlelight, her lips moving soundlessly. He admitted he no longer believed it was his sister inside that body. One evening, as Ruiz prepared prayers at the rectory, he received word that the mother had collapsed. Exhaustion and grief had overwhelmed her, leaving the children vulnerable. He rushed back to the house and found the boy shaking with fear, insisting that Maria had begun speaking in two voices at once, her own and another, overlapping. Ruiz entered the room cautiously. The sight burned into his memory. Maria sitting upright in bed, her eyes closed, her mouth moving with eerie precision. From her throat emerged two distinct tones, one faintly her own, weak and tired, the other deeper, mocking, almost amused. The priest described the moment as a confrontation. The second voice stopped abruptly, and without opening her eyes said, "You have no right here." Ruiz responded instinctively, demanding in Christ's name that the presence identify itself fully. The entity laughed through her lips, a chilling, guttural sound that sent the boy fleeing into the hallway. Then, clearly, it repeated, "Aquel que espera." Ruiz pressed the crucifix to her chest. She writhed, her skin blistering beneath the touch, yet the voice continued, undeterred. "You cannot cast me out. She opened the ground. She invited me." That claim struck him like a blow. Could it be true? Had Maria even unknowingly been complicit in her torment? He recalled the night she had scratched her nails bloody against the floor, as if trying to dig something free. The thought unsettled him deeply. The next morning, after hours of debate with himself, Ruiz resolved to act. He wrote a letter to Bishop Ortega, pleading once more for permission to perform the rite, detailing the dangers to both the girl and the community. He sent the letter with a trusted villager, but knew it could take days, perhaps weeks, for a reply. He could not wait. That evening, he gathered what he needed: the Roman ritual, holy water, a crucifix, blessed oil, and the strength of his faith. He called on 2 villagers he trusted to help restrain Maria, warning them that they must not falter regardless of what they saw or heard. They agreed reluctantly, more out of loyalty to the priest than courage. The rite began after sunset. The family huddled nearby, praying in hushed voices. Candles lit the small room, casting unsteady shadows across the walls. Maria lay restrained, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Ruiz began. His voice carried steady through the opening prayers, his hands trembling only slightly. He demanded that the presence identify itself under the authority of Christ. For a long moment, there was no response. Then Maria's eyes snapped open. She fixed him with a stare so intense that he swore it pierced through him. Her lips curled into a smile, and the deep voice spoke, "Your prayers are nothing here." The restraint strained as her body convulsed violently. The villagers held her down, their faces pale with terror. Ruiz pressed forward, his voice louder, commanding the spirit to depart. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. Breath fogged in the air, the candles sputtered, though no draft stirred. A pounding began beneath the floor again, this time in rhythm with the priest's prayers, as though mocking them. Suddenly Maria's voice shifted. She cried out in her own voice, desperate and terrified, "Help me, please!" Her mother rushed forward, sobbing, but Ruiz stopped her. He had read that demons often mimicked the victim, using pleas for mercy to weaken resolve. Still, the cry tore at him. He pressed the crucifix firmly against Maria's forehead. Her skin sizzled, the smell of burning flesh filling the room. She shrieked, thrashing wildly, her eyes rolling back. Then, in that same guttural tone, the entity spoke again. "She belongs to me. She gave me her fear. And you gave me your doubt." Ruiz faltered, the words cutting deep. He remembered his hesitation, his secret nights of questioning. Could it truly draw strength from that? He clenched his teeth and forced himself onward, reciting the prayers louder, almost shouting to drown the voice. The struggle lasted hours. By the time dawn broke, Ruiz was drenched in sweat, his voice hoarse. Maria had collapsed into unconsciousness, her body limp. The villagers released their grip, trembling, unwilling to look at her. Her mother asked if it was finished. Ruiz could only shake his head. "It is weaker," he said, though even as he spoke he was unsure. "But it is not gone." And then he showed me something that made my blood run cold. From his pocket, Ruiz drew a small cloth pouch. Inside were objects he had taken from beneath the floor during the first digging, fragments of bone, brittle strands of hair, and rusted coffin nails. He told me he kept them as evidence, though he sometimes questioned whether keeping them had been a mistake. As he spoke, his voice lowered. When she whispered that name, "The one who waits," I remembered an old local tale. They say this land once held those denied Christian burial. Some claim suicides, others heretics. They were buried in silence, without prayer, without peace. Perhaps that is what waits beneath, the restless, abandoned dead. He closed the pouch with shaking hands. Or perhaps worse. The case was far from over, for in the days that followed, Maria awoke again. She was weaker, thinner, but her eyes burned with something no illness could explain. She looked at Ruiz and said calmly in perfect Latin, "You cannot bury me again." The air in the room remained heavy, long after Father Antonio finished his words. I recall glancing toward the floorboards beneath our feet, as though I might see them breathe or shift, and I wondered what it would have been like for that family to sleep above what lay hidden beneath them. My tape recorder clicked faintly as it captured the father's steady voice, though I noticed how, at certain points, his eyes had lost focus, as if he were no longer speaking to me, but rather to himself, reliving something he had tried hard to bury. Father Antonio said the house had already grown infamous in the small community before he became involved. Neighbors whispered about the strange stains on the floor that refused to fade no matter how many times they were scrubbed. He described how the family, particularly the mother, would hear whispers late at night, faint, disembodied conversations that seemed to rise from beneath the planks. The voices weren't loud, yet they were clear enough that she could make out fragments of words. At first she thought it was her imagination, but when her daughter admitted to hearing the same murmurs, she knew something unnatural was occurring. The situation escalated when the family began noticing objects out of place. Simple items like cutlery, children's toys, or a folded blanket would be discovered across the room, sometimes arranged in deliberate patterns, as though someone or something was leaving a message. The children complained of cold spots that would linger near their beds. Even on warm summer nights, the air grew so cold it left their breath visible. When I pressed Father Antonio on how he first entered the case, he admitted it had begun with hesitation. At that time, the church had strict rules about intervening in what might be labeled folk superstition. The family's parish priest, however, had been unable to cope with the mounting pressure. Parishioners were beginning to ask why the church remained silent, why it offered only prayers that did nothing to quell the disturbances. That priest reached out quietly to Father Antonio, knowing his reputation for handling what others would not. The first time he entered the house, he said it was mid-afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the windows, but it did nothing to soften the unease that wrapped itself around the walls. He described the silence as unnatural, a silence that listens back, were his exact words. On the kitchen table, he found a small plate of salt that the family had placed there, following the advice of an elderly neighbor who believed it might absorb the evil. The salt, he noted, had turned damp and clumped together, though there was no moisture in the air. It was in that same kitchen that Father Antonio saw the first undeniable sign. As he stood speaking with the family, the plaster above the stove cracked sharply, like a whip. Dust fell across their heads. Slowly, letters began to form in the crumbling surface, etched as if by invisible hands. He told me he would never forget the word that emerged: culpa, guilt. The father of the family, a stoic man, tried to dismiss it, insisting that perhaps the plaster had long been weak, but his hands trembled when he spoke. Father Antonio said the most haunting part was not the word itself, but the reaction of the children. They had seen it before. In their quiet voices, they explained that words appeared in the walls often, sometimes names, sometimes accusations, but always with that same sense of accusation, as though the house itself was passing judgment. I asked him whether he believed at that stage it was a haunting or possession. He shook his head slowly, emphasizing that it was too early to say. The church discouraged quick conclusions, yet he could not ignore what happened on his second visit. That evening, as he prepared to bless the rooms, the youngest daughter convulsed suddenly, collapsing to the floor. She was only 12 years old, thin and fragile, and her body contorted in a way no child's should. The family screamed, certain she was dying. When Father Antonio knelt beside her, he realized she was murmuring something. Her lips moved fast, too fast for a girl her age, whispering words in a tongue he recognized but could not understand fully, an archaic form of Latin, older than the church's own liturgy. The girl had never studied Latin. In school she had barely learned French, and yet, with her eyes rolled back and her voice deepened to something that seemed not her own, she repeated phrases of judgment, phrases of burial, phrases that spoke of blood beneath the house. When she finally stilled, she gasped as though surfacing from water. The family crowded her, sobbing, but the girl stared at them blankly, as though she did not recognize their faces. It was in that moment, Father Antonio told me, that he understood the evil in the house was not confined to the floorboards or the walls. It had seeped into the family itself. He grew quiet for a long time, and I refrained from breaking the silence. Eventually he whispered, "That was when I knew." We were no longer speaking of a haunting. It was possession, and I was alone with it. The father described his attempts to involve the church. His requests for assistance were met with skepticism. Officials cautioned him not to act rashly. They feared ridicule, feared the growing divide between science and faith. One bishop even advised him to seek medical examinations for the girl before proceeding. The implication was clear: prove first that there was no earthly explanation. And so, reluctantly, Father Antonio encouraged the family to bring the girl to a physician. She was examined at length. Doctors suspected epilepsy, though the fits never matched its usual signs. Others suggested mental illness, but her symptoms shifted too quickly, sometimes vanishing for days before returning with ferocity. The family grew desperate, caught between science that offered no solutions and a church unwilling to act. Meanwhile, the disturbances worsened. Neighbors began reporting that the family's windows glowed faintly at night, as though candles flickered within, though the family swore no lights were lit. Dogs refused to enter the yard, growling low at the threshold before retreating, and the voices in the house grew louder. No longer whispers, but full sentences, sometimes overlapping, sometimes mocking prayers recited aloud. Father Antonio told me that his breaking point came one night when he returned unannounced. He found the girl in her room, crouched in the corner, speaking rapidly to the shadows. Her parents begged him not to enter, claiming she was only playing. But he stepped inside, and when she turned her head toward him, her mouth opened wider than should have been possible. What came out was not speech. It was a howl, guttural and layered, as if several voices spoke at once. That was when he resolved that an exorcism would be inevitable, no matter what his superior
Father
said.
Antonio's voice grew quieter when he reached this point in the account, as though the memories themselves demanded a hush. He told me that, in those days, decisions about exorcism were never made lightly. They required the church's approval, which often came slowly, if at all. Yet the situation in the Belmez house had become impossible to ignore. The family was unraveling. The girl's episodes left her weaker each time, her eyes sunken, her skin pale. The mother began refusing to sleep, terrified that if she closed her eyes, something would happen to her daughter in the night. Antonio described the father as broken in a different way, outwardly stoic, but increasingly withdrawn. He had begun to spend more time outside, working in the yard until after dark, as though manual labor might drown out the sounds from inside. But neighbors noticed he had taken to drinking, his hands unsteady when he greeted them at the market. It was during this decline that Father Antonio made his formal request. He drafted a letter to the diocese, detailing what he had witnessed: the girl's unnatural convulsions, her ability to speak in a language she had never learned, and the growing physical manifestations within the home. The words on the plaster, the unexplained movements, the voices. He received no immediate reply. Weeks passed. He continued to visit the family, offering blessings and prayers, but he felt increasingly helpless. Each time he left, he admitted to me, he wondered if he would return to find the girl dead, or worse. It was not until another priest, Father Miguel Ruiz, came to Belmez on unrelated parish duties that progress was made. Father Miguel was younger, less experienced, but open-minded. When Antonio shared the details, Miguel urged him to push harder. Together, they traveled to the diocesan office in person, presenting not just Antonio's observations, but testimony from neighbors, even a physician who admitted the girl's episodes could not be explained by known illnesses. The bishop finally agreed to a conditional approval. The case would be observed more closely, and if necessary, preparations for a rite could be made. Father Antonio's voice carried bitterness when he told me this. He believed the church had been more concerned with avoiding scandal than saving the child. Still, for the first time, he was permitted to gather the necessary tools: holy water, relics, a crucifix, and the formal prayers of exorcism. He emphasized that he did not yet call what followed the exorcism. In his words, it was a preparation, a testing of strength. That first night, he entered the house accompanied by Father Miguel and 2 lay assistants from the parish. The family gathered in the main room, trembling. The girl was seated in a chair near the wall. She appeared calm at first, even subdued, her thin hands folded neatly in her lap. Antonio described how strange it felt to see her in such stillness, given the chaos of previous weeks. But when he opened his book of prayers, she began to hum. The sound was low at first, almost tuneless, but gradually it grew into a melody. He said it chilled him because he recognized it, not as a hymn but as a funeral chant used in monasteries centuries ago, one she could never have known. When he sprinkled the first drops of holy water across her forehead, she shrieked, not like a frightened child, but like something burned. The chair rocked backward, though no one touched it. The family screamed. Antonio pressed forward, determined, his crucifix raised. What followed left him shaken for years to come. The girl's voice shifted mid-cry, turning deep, guttural and layered. Words poured out, not only in Latin, but in what sounded like fragments of older tongues, Syriac, perhaps even Hebrew. Miguel, shaken, whispered that she was cursing the prayers as Antonio read them. The assistants tried to steady her, but she fought with unnatural strength. At one point her head struck the back of the chair so hard, Antonio feared she would break her skull. He halted the prayers, commanding silence in the name of Christ. For a brief moment the room stilled, and then, beneath the silence, came a sound none of them could explain. A dull scratching, rising from beneath the floorboards. It grew louder, like nails dragged along wood, until everyone present was staring at the planks beneath their feet. The mother sobbed, insisting the noises had haunted them for months. Antonio admitted to me that this was the first time he believed the evil was not just inside the girl, it was bound to the house itself. That night they ended the prayers prematurely. Antonio feared pressing further without full authorization. They left the house shaken, their clothes reeking of sweat and candle smoke. Father Miguel confided later that he had felt something follow them as they departed, as if unseen eyes tracked their every step. Antonio wrote again to the bishop, this time pleading for urgency. He explained that the girl's condition was worsening and that the manifestations had begun spreading through the house in ways he could no longer control. His words were desperate. If we delay, we may lose her soul. Days later, approval was granted for a formal exorcism. When Father Antonio told me this, his hands trembled slightly on the table between us. He confessed that part of him wished the church had continued to refuse. The decision meant he would stand in direct confrontation with something he was not certain he could defeat. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the chapel's crucifix, before finishing his recollection of that period. It is one thing to pray over illness. It is another to face something that speaks through a child in voices older than your church. I remember writing those words down carefully, the weight of them pressing on me even as I listened. What followed next, he warned me, would be darker still. The room where Father Antonio chose to begin the rite had once been the family's dining room. By the time of the exorcism, it had been stripped of nearly all furniture. Only a wooden table remained, cleared of dishes and replaced with the tools of the ritual. A crucifix, holy water, a relic of a saint enclosed in glass, and a thick, leather-bound book of prayers. The family stood close together in the corner, their eyes wide, the mother clutching her rosary so tightly that the beads cut into her skin. The girl sat in the chair once again, her wrists bound with cloth to keep her from harming herself. Father Antonio told me that he hesitated before tying her, but the memory of her previous convulsions left him with no choice. It was the night of the exorcism, when the house itself seemed to prepare. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters violently, though the skies were clear. Inside, the temperature fell steadily, until every breath showed in the air. Antonio said the cold did not feel natural. It seemed to rise from the very stones beneath the house. He began with the litany of the saints. His voice was steady at first, though he admitted later that his throat felt tight. Father Miguel knelt beside him, echoing the responses. The girl remained silent through the first prayers, her eyes fixed on Antonio, with a stillness that unsettled him more than any outburst. It was when he raised the crucifix that her demeanor changed. Her lips curled back, revealing teeth clenched so hard they squealed. Slowly her body stiffened, her back arching against the chair. And then, in a tone that did not belong to a child, she began to speak. The words came in Latin at first, but twisted, distorted, phrases Antonio recognized only partially, like fragments of scripture turned backward. Then the voice shifted, layered with others, deep and mocking. Culpa est vestra. The guilt is yours. The family cried out, begging Antonio to stop. but he pressed forward. He sprinkled holy water over her head. At once she screamed, a cry so piercing it seemed to shake the windows. Her body convulsed against the bindings, and from beneath the floorboards came that same scraping sound he had heard before, as though something clawed at the wood. The assistants tightened their grip on the chair. Father Miguel held the relic before her face, commanding the spirit to name itself. For a moment there was only silence. Then she whispered, so softly, Antonio leaned forward to hear it. The word she uttered was enterrado, buried. The family froze. The father swore under his breath. The word echoed in Antonio's mind, because it was the same rumor that had circulated in Belmez for years, that bones, coffins, something had been buried beneath the house long before the family lived there. Antonio forced himself to continue. He recited the prayers louder now, pushing his voice against the resistance in the room. The girl thrashed violently, the chair legs scraping across the stone floor. Her voice shifted again, no longer whispering but laughing, a shrill, cruel laugh that erupted from her small frame. "Non exis," she hissed. "You will not drive me out." Candles flickered wildly. One was snuffed out completely, though no draught stirred the air. The smell of smoke thickened, acrid, as though something far older than wax burned within the room. At one point, Antonio swore the shadows on the wall moved independently of the candlelight. Figures seemed to twist and elongate, almost forming faces, watching. He dared not look directly at them for long, fearing distraction would weaken him. The exorcism lasted hours. Antonio described it as a battle of endurance, his prayers repeated again and again, each word a strike against the presence. Yet each time he gained ground, the voice inside the girl retaliated with words that struck at their faith. "You build your house on graves. Your God does not answer you. Every nail beneath you belongs to me." The girl's mouth bled where she had bitten her tongue raw. Her eyes darted between Antonio and Miguel, sharp and aware, as though something inside her understood every intention they carried. Finally, as dawn approached, Antonio reached the closing prayer of deliverance. His voice cracked from exhaustion, but he did not falter. The girl's body writhed, then suddenly stilled. A low groan escaped her lips, followed by silence. For the first time that night, her eyes cleared. She looked directly at her mother and whispered her name. The family rushed to embrace her, sobbing with relief. Antonio felt his own knees weaken, though he refused to believe it was over. And he was right. As he packed the relic and closed the book, a sound reverberated through the room, 3 sharp knocks from beneath the floor. The girl flinched at the sound, clutching her stomach. Antonio turned to Miguel, whose face had gone pale. The exorcism had freed her body, but the house still breathed with the presence. The morning light outside the Belmez house should have brought relief, but Father Antonio told me it only deepened his unease. The girl was calmer, exhausted, but seemingly freed of the immediate torment. Yet the memory of those 3 knocks beneath the floorboards clung to him like a shadow. The family clung to the hope that the ordeal was finished. The mother wept openly, thanking both priests and promising prayers for their strength. But Antonio could not shake the sense that they had dealt only with a fragment of the evil. He reminded the parents gently that an exorcism was rarely concluded in a single session. More troubling still was the house itself, which had not been touched by the rite. The following day, Father Antonio returned alone. He wanted to walk the rooms in silence without distraction. He said the house felt different when empty, as though its walls relaxed once the family had gone about their daily errands. The air was cold, but not unnaturally so. He pressed his ear to the floorboards of the dining room, straining for any sound. At first there was nothing, then faintly he heard it, the dull scrape, like wood against stone, far below. Antonio told me that moment cemented his conviction. What afflicted the family had roots not just in the spiritual realm, but in the ground beneath their home. He was no archaeologist, no historian, yet he knew that Belmez was a town layered with centuries of burial and conquest. He suspected that the house had been built on ground that should have been left untouched. Still, to speak of such things was dangerous. The church tolerated discussion of possession. It did not welcome priests speculating about cursed land or sacrilegious foundations. Yet Antonio could not ignore what he had seen. He shared his suspicions with Father Miguel, who was reluctant but agreed that something lay beneath the house. Miguel suggested they seek permission to inspect the foundations. Antonio doubted they would receive it, but he approached the family regardless. The father resisted at first. Digging beneath the house seemed unthinkable. It was their only home and money was already scarce. But the mother, still shaken by her daughter's suffering, insisted that if something was buried there, it must be revealed. She said the word buried, as though it had become poisoned in her mouth. And so, days later, with shovels borrowed from neighbors, the family and the priests pried up the first of the old floorboards. Antonio described the moment with a slow heaviness, as though recounting a ritual itself. The planks creaked and splintered, releasing dust that smelled of earth long sealed. Beneath them lay packed soil, dark and damp despite the arid season. They dug carefully, inch by inch. The father worked until sweat streamed from his brow. Antonio prayed silently as he watched, his eyes fixed on the growing pit. The children were sent outside, their mother too unsettled to remain near. The first object unearthed was a rusted nail. At first it seemed unremarkable, until Antonio noticed its size, far thicker and longer than any carpentry nail. He knew immediately it was a coffin nail. He turned it in his hand, its edges eaten by corrosion, and felt a sickness settle in his stomach. They continued. More nails surfaced, then fragments of decayed wood, blackened and brittle. Finally, a small clump of hair, matted and hardened into the soil, appeared beneath the spade. Antonio said he nearly dropped his rosary when he saw it, because it looked impossibly preserved, as though it had been waiting to be found. The father cursed softly and stepped back. Miguel knelt closer, crossing himself. The pit had revealed evidence of disturbed burials, though no bones yet. The smell of rot clung faintly to the air, faint but unmistakable. Antonio admitted to me that at that moment he wished desperately to cover it all again. But the presence in the house had already tied itself to the family. Closing the hole would not erase what they had uncovered. That night, the girl suffered another fit. Though she had been stable for days, she woke screaming that hands were reaching for her from beneath the bed. The family rushed to her room and found her pressed against the headboard, pointing at the floorboards. When Antonio knelt there later, he swore he felt the faint vibration of knocking, 3 times, deliberate, steady. Word began to spread in the village. Neighbors whispered that the house sat on cursed ground, some even claiming to have seen faces in the windows at night. Antonio grew concerned that hysteria would erupt, but he also felt a grim certainty. The evil in the house was not finished. The church demanded reports, and Antonio sent them carefully written accounts. He mentioned the disturbances, the prayers, even the girl's temporary relief, but he hesitated to describe the nails and hair. He feared that speaking too openly of the excavation would brand him a superstitious fool. Still, he could not ignore the truth. What they had uncovered was no ordinary burial. Something had been sealed there intentionally. As he told me this, Father Antonio paused and glanced toward the stone floor of the chapel where we sat. He ran his fingers across the grain of the stone, then said softly, "There are some graves the earth itself rejects, and when that happens, it is not the dead who suffer. It is the living who walk above them." I wrote those words down exactly as he spoke them, the weight of them lingering long after. Because what followed, he warned me, was the moment the case turned from terrible to unbearable. The silence that fell over the group after Don Carlos's words was suffocating. Even the smallest shuffle of boots across the packed dirt seemed to carry like thunder beneath the house. No one spoke for several minutes, as though voicing anything aloud might stir the malevolent atmosphere pressing in on them. Finally, Antonio whispered, "Padre, what do we do with it?" He gestured to the dark soil where the coffin nails and clumps of human hair still lay scattered. His face looked drawn, like the air had been drained out of him. Don Carlos crouched once more, his expression taut. "We do not leave it exposed," he said firmly. "If this was placed here with intent, then to leave it open would be to invite whatever force lingers to come forth unchecked." He began gathering the objects carefully, using a folded scrap of cloth rather than his bare hands. Each nail, each filthy lock of hair, he placed into the cloth with a grim delicacy. The others stood back, some crossing themselves silently. I watched closely, jotting notes, even as a strange unease crept through me. There was something ceremonial in the way he handled the objects, though he said no prayers aloud. Later I would reflect on how odd it was that he seemed to recognize immediately that they could not be treated as ordinary remains. When he had gathered them all, he tied the cloth tightly and instructed Antonio to fetch a small metal box from the sacristy. "We must contain them," he muttered. But even as he gave these instructions, another sound cut through the air, faint at first, then clearer. A dragging scrape, as though something heavy were moving across the floor above us. All of us froze. The house above was empty. Maria had gone to stay with her sister that night. Antonio glanced upward, terror flashing in his eyes. "Padre," he whispered, "no one should be there." Don Carlos did not speak immediately. His head tilted slightly, his brow furrowed as he listened. The scraping noise grew louder, joined by what I can only describe as a muffled thud, a weight being dropped then dragged again. It continued for several long moments before falling suddenly silent. Father Don Carlos looked at me then, his eyes sharp, as though to confirm I too had heard it. I nodded. "I recorded it," I whispered, tapping the small device in my pocket. That seemed to steady him, though only slightly. "We finished this," he said in a voice that brooked no hesitation. The metal box was brought, the bundle placed inside, and Don Carlos sealed it with careful precision. He spoke a brief prayer in Latin, not loud but deliberate, before closing the lid with a soft metallic snap. When the box was lifted, however, Antonio gasped. The soil beneath where the bundle had lain was damp, though the surrounding earth remained dry. It was as though water, or something far thicker, had seeped into the ground, only at that precise spot. "Esto no es natural," Antonio muttered. Don Carlos pressed his lips together. "No, it is not." We returned above ground, each man pale and shaken. The house felt colder than before, though no windows were open. I noticed my own hands trembling as I wrote, the ink blotting across the page. That night, Don Carlos did not allow anyone to remain in the house. Maria was told not to return. He took the sealed box back to the rectory, locking it within the church's stone cellar. But the disturbances did not end. In the days that followed, townspeople reported hearing strange sounds in the street outside the Belmez home, whispering voices that seemed to emerge from nowhere. A young boy told his mother he saw shadows walking near the windows, though no one was inside. Most disturbing of all were the marks that began to appear on the walls, not faces this time, but crude, childlike drawings made in what looked like charcoal or ash. Crosses inverted, figures with hollow circles for eyes. They would vanish within hours, as though absorbed back into the plaster. I confirmed these reports myself. On the third day, I stood in the empty house and saw with my own eyes one of the faint sketches etched near the hearth. I rubbed it with my sleeve. It smeared like soot, but there had been no fire lit. When I told Don Carlos, he grew quiet. After a long silence, he confessed something to me that chilled me more than all else. He said that the hair and coffin nails we found were not what had truly frightened him. What unsettled me, he admitted, was how carefully they were placed. This was not an accident, it was ritual. Someone meant for it to remain hidden, but alive. His words pressed upon me heavily. If he was right, then this was not just an old curse uncovered by chance. It was an unfinished working, a ritual still feeding, still binding, waiting for discovery. The father's face, normally firm with resolve, looked older then. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I fear," he said, "that in disturbing it, we have given it breath again." The weeks that followed marked a turning point. Until then, the disturbances had belonged to the house itself. Voices in the walls, marks appearing and vanishing, shadows pacing the empty rooms. But after Don Carlos's confession, the focus shifted. The weight of it seemed to press upon one person more than any other. Maria Gomez, the woman whose home had become a shrine of fear. I met her for the first time properly in late autumn. She was 43, modest in dress, her hair pinned neatly, her speech soft. There was nothing about her that hinted at the extraordinary attention her life would soon attract. The townspeople had begun whispering that the curse beneath her floor had marked her. Not her family, not Antonio who had dug, but Maria herself. At first, she dismissed it. "I am not superstitious," she told me plainly, as we sat at her sister's kitchen table. "But since they opened the ground, I do not sleep." Her hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt. "I feel watched, not from the outside, but from within." Her sister looked away quickly when Maria said this, and I understood why. The family feared the rumors, feared what such talk might mean in a devout community where whispers spread faster than fire. Don Carlos, when I asked him, was reluctant to label it. "Exhaustion," he said at first. "Stress." But his eyes betrayed doubt. The first clear sign came one night in November. Maria woke screaming, her voice shrill enough to rouse the neighbors. Antonio and Don Carlos, summoned urgently, found her standing rigid in the center of her sister's room. Her arms hung stiff at her sides, her head thrown back, eyes wide open. She was silent when they entered, but the mattress bore deep claw marks, as if fingernails had raked through the fabric with unnatural force. "She could not have done this alone," Antonio told me later, his voice low. "Her hands, they were not even bleeding." When Don Carlos recounted this, his tone hardened. This was the first moment I allowed myself to say the word aloud. Oppression. Something was pressing upon her. The difference between affliction and possession is often a slow, dangerous line. That night, she crossed the first step. From then, her condition worsened. She began speaking in her sleep. Low mutterings in a tongue neither her family nor neighbors recognized. I recorded one of these sessions myself. To my ear, it was not Spanish, nor any dialect I knew. When I later shared it with a linguist in Madrid, he could only offer this. It carries structure, rhythm, but no syntax I can identify. It sounds old. Doctors were brought. One suggested nervous hysteria, another epileptic seizures. They prescribed sedatives. Yet under their treatment, her episodes only grew stranger. On one occasion, after being given medication, Maria's body stiffened and she began to weep, not in her own voice, but in the guttural timbre of a man decades older. Witnesses swore the sound could not have come from her. Her health deteriorated too quickly for science to keep up. Bruises bloomed across her arms without cause. Her weight dropped drastically, though her appetite had not. At times, she refused food entirely, whispering that it tasted of soil and iron. The town began to turn. Children were kept from the Gomez house. Women crossed themselves when Maria passed by. One old man spat openly in the street, muttering that she had brought this curse on them all. When I asked Don Carlos about this, his expression was bitter. "It is always the same," he said. "Fear finds its scapegoat. They forget she is victim, not culprit." Yet even he admitted to me one detail that unsettled him deeply. "During confession," he said quietly, "she came to me. She wept and begged me to listen. And then her voice, it changed." He paused, the memory clearly heavy. "She said words to me that only I should have known. Private things from my youth, spoken in a mocking tone." He would not repeat what those words were. His lips pressed thin, and I did not push. By December, there was no longer doubt. Maria was no longer merely oppressed. She was inhabited. The symptoms came swiftly and mercilessly. She vomited black fluid streaked with strands of hair. Her body convulsed violently, though no fever marked her. Once, before witnesses, she lifted from her bed by several inches, her body stiff as though nailed in the air, before crashing back with a crack that shook the floorboards. The Bishop of Jaén was consulted. At first he advised caution, insisting on medical evaluation. But as reports multiplied, not from peasants but from physicians and schoolteachers who swore they had seen the phenomena themselves, the church's hesitation weakened. I still remember the night Don Carlos told me, in a whisper that trembled, "They will allow an exorcism." His face then was not triumphant. It was grave, because permission meant one thing: acknowledgement that what they faced was no longer natural. And yet, even in that moment, he warned me, "Do not believe this is victory. Every exorcism is a battle that leaves scars on all who stand near it. Looking back now, it was this stage, before the rite itself began, that I remember most vividly. The signs were undeniable, the fear unmistakable, but there was still a terrible uncertainty hanging over us. Was Maria truly possessed? Or had the digging under her home awakened something deeper? Something older than Christianity, older even than the soil of Belmez itself? Don Carlos feared the latter, and in his eyes I saw the reflection of that dread. The authorization came quietly, without ceremony, and with a weight that none of us mistook for reassurance. Don Carlos told me one evening at the rectory, the lamp between us casting a faint yellow glow on his weary face. He placed the bishop's letter on the table. The parchment trembled slightly under his hand, though whether from the draught or his own unease I could not tell. "The bishop has given consent," he said simply, "on condition that it remains discreet. The church will not have scandal nor rumor of spectacle. If this becomes public, it will bring shame on all involved." He paused, then added almost bitterly, "And yet it is already public, is it not? The whole town speaks of nothing else." Indeed, Belmez was divided. Some whispered that Maria was the victim of witchcraft, others that she had invited darkness upon herself. A few clung desperately to medical explanations, though the physicians themselves had withdrawn, unwilling to be mocked for failures they could not explain. In the tavern, men muttered that the priests were hiding truths too dangerous for ordinary people to hear. Don Carlos moved carefully through this tension. He knew that secrecy was both protection and burden. He selected only a handful of witnesses for what was to come: Antonio, Maria's sister, 2 parish women of strong faith, and myself, the reporter. When I questioned why I had been included, he looked at me with something between resignation and warning. "You must record it," he said, "not for spectacle, but for truth. If we do not survive this, there must remain an account." Preparations began in the Gomez house, though the exorcism itself would not take place there. Don Carlos insisted it be moved to a side chapel of the parish, a space smaller, enclosed and consecrated. The house was tainted, he said, too deeply marked by the ritual objects unearthed beneath its floor. Still, he returned there daily to pray, carrying a vial of holy water and a small silver crucifix. He sprinkled every threshold, every window. Yet each evening when I accompanied him, we found signs of defiance: crucifixes inverted, salt scattered in patterns like mocking circles, and once a dead bird left on the kitchen table, its wings splayed unnaturally wide. Maria herself grew worse with each passing day. Her eyes darkened with deep hollows, her skin grew pallid. At times she spoke in whispers that carried no resemblance to her voice, guttural, commanding. Other times she would fall into silence, her body rigid, as if something within her tightened its grip. I recorded one such episode. In it, she sits perfectly still while her sister begs her to speak. After several minutes of silence, Maria suddenly turns her head toward me. Though her lips hardly move, a male voice emerges, thick and graveled. "You should not write this." When I replayed the tape later, the words remained. The community's fear deepened. A few parishioners accused Don Carlos of fueling hysteria, of letting old superstitions consume reason. Others pleaded with him to end it quickly, fearing the curse would spread. He bore it all silently, though I could see the toll in his eyes. In preparation for the rite, he fasted. He confessed his own sins daily, a discipline he later admitted was not for himself alone, but for the strength it might lend against what he was about to face. "When the enemy enters," he told me in a rare moment of candor, "he searches for weakness. He knows the cracks in each of us, and he exploits them." The night before the exorcism, I found him in the chapel, kneeling before the altar. His lips moved soundlessly, the crucifix clenched tightly in his hands. When he rose, he seemed smaller, but his gaze was steady. "They will not allow this to be easy," he said. He did not need to explain who they were. On the morning of the rite, Maria was brought into the chapel. She resisted at first, her body thrashing with strength unnatural for her frame. It took Antonio and 2 others to restrain her. Once seated in the wooden chair prepared for her, her movements subsided, but her expression shifted into a chilling smile. Not Maria's, not even human in its cruelty. Don Carlos laid his hand upon her head, and for a brief moment, silence fell, thick and suffocating. That silence broke with a laugh, low, guttural, echoing against the chapel walls, though Maria's lips barely parted. It was the kind of sound that freezes every muscle in the body, and even now I find it difficult to describe without unease. Antonio muttered a prayer under his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped the chair. Don Carlos opened the Ritual Romanum. His voice shook only at the first word, then steadied with each Latin phrase. The prayers of exorcism had begun. What followed that morning was only the beginning, but even in those first invocations, the air thickened, the candles wavered, though no draught stirred, and Maria's body convulsed with movements that no frail woman should have been capable of. It was then I understood. The Father had been right. This would not be easy, and it would not end without cost. The first session began in mid-morning, but the chapel felt as though it was set apart from time. The small windows admitted little light, and the heavy stone walls seemed to hold the cold within them. We were few, Don Carlos at the head, Antonio and 2 parish women seated at either side, Maria bound gently but firmly to the wooden chair, and myself, seated in the corner with my notebook and recorder. Don Carlos stood before her, the Ritual Romanum open in his hand. His voice filled the chamber in steady Latin, each word clipped with precision. At first Maria only sat still, her head drooped, her breathing shallow. One might have thought her drugged, if not for the unnatural tension in her limbs. It was when the words "Adjuro te spiritus immunde" left his lips that the atmosphere shifted. Maria's body convulsed violently, her head snapping back. A guttural cry tore from her throat, too deep to belong to her. The 2 parish women gasped, clutching rosaries, but Don Carlos did not falter. He raised the crucifix high, pressing it toward her forehead. She laughed. The sound was not mocking in the ordinary sense. It was jagged, broken, layered. It echoed as though more than one voice laughed at once. My recorder captured it, though even the tape seemed to struggle with its distortion. "You waste your words, priest," the voice spat, not hers, but masculine, guttural. "She is mine." Antonio lurched forward, but Don Carlos raised a hand to still him. "Name yourself," he commanded firmly in Latin. "Name yourself in the presence of Christ." Maria's body writhed, her face contorting in ways that seemed impossible for human bone and muscle. Then came a hiss, like air escaping from deep within the earth. "No name. Names are for the weak." For a moment the chapel grew darker, though no cloud had crossed the sun outside. The candles sputtered, their flames bending toward her rather than away. The parish women sobbed quietly, yet Don Carlos pressed on. I wrote as quickly as I could, though my hand trembled. Every instinct urged me to flee, yet something stronger compelled me to stay. A duty to bear witness, even if it meant carrying scars I could never explain. The prayers continued, Don Carlos's voice louder, firmer. Maria's body thrashed against the restraints, yet the chair held. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, then fixed suddenly on Don Carlos with piercing clarity. "You think you can drive me out?" the voice growled. "Do you know what lies beneath her floor? Do you know who placed it there? I was welcomed." The mention of the floor struck me sharply. My mind raced back to the coffin nails and human hair unearthed weeks before. Don Carlos's jaw tightened, but he did not respond. Instead, he pressed the crucifix firmly against Maria's chest. Her scream was inhuman. The sound clawed at the stone walls, reverberating in my chest until I thought my ribs might crack. Antonio crossed himself, whispering prayers in rapid Spanish. Then silence. Maria slumped forward, her body limp, her breathing ragged. For a moment, we thought it might be over. Don Carlos lowered the crucifix, his face pale but composed. But then, slowly, her head lifted. Her lips curved into a grotesque smile. "Not one," the voice whispered. "Many." The temperature in the chapel dropped abruptly. My breath fogged in the air, and the parish women clutched each other in terror. Don Carlos's voice did not waver. "If there are many, then all shall fall," he declared, returning to the prayers with renewed force. What followed was an hour of struggle. The entity, or entities, within Maria shifted between voices, some male, some female, some speaking in tongues unrecognizable to any of us. At times she mimicked the voices of those present, repeating Antonio's own whispered prayers back to him with perfect inflection, but twisted into mockery. At other moments, she revealed knowledge that chilled us all, the maiden name of one parish woman's deceased mother, the exact words of a private sin Antonio had confessed years earlier. Each revelation struck like a lash, but Don Carlos refused to yield. By midday, Maria collapsed once more, her body drained, her face damp with sweat. Don Carlos signaled that the session would end there. She was carried to a cot in an adjoining room, where her sister wept quietly over her. When we stepped outside, the light of the sun felt alien, as though we had emerged from some other realm. Don Carlos leaned heavily on the chapel doorframe, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "This is only the beginning," he told me. His voice was hoarse but steady. "It will return stronger, and so must we." He looked at me then, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw fear plain in his eyes. The second session was held 2 days later. Don Carlos had insisted on rest, both for himself and for Maria, though rest was a relative term. Those 2 days were marked by a deep unease that spread through the parish like an unseen sickness. Neighbors claimed to hear screams echoing from the chapel even when it stood empty. Children said the church bells rang faintly at night, though no one touched the ropes. When Maria was brought back into the chapel, her body bore the marks of the struggle. Her wrists, though padded during restraint, were bruised. Her lips were cracked, her face hollowed. Yet her eyes were sharp, glinting with something that was not her. She seemed to recognize each of us, though the recognition was not Maria's. As she was secured to the chair once more, she leaned forward as far as the restraints allowed and whispered to Antonio in a low, gravelled voice, "You should have left her in the ground." He recoiled, his face draining of color. Don Carlos began the prayers swiftly, wasting no time. His voice was steadier than before, louder, as though determined not to allow the entity space to breathe. The words rang against the stone walls, ancient syllables heavy with command. At first Maria sat motionless, her face slack. Then, without warning, her body jolted violently upward. The chair itself scraped across the floor, though no one touched it. She convulsed, her back arching in unnatural angles, her head thrown back until her neck seemed ready to snap. A shrill cry burst from her throat, high, piercing, inhuman. It echoed so fiercely that one of the parish women fainted where she stood. Antonio caught her before she hit the floor, whispering frantic prayers. The other parish woman clutched her rosary, tears streaming silently down her face. She did not look at Maria. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the crucifix in Don Carlos's hand, as though afraid that even glancing at the afflicted would invite something upon her. Don Carlos pressed the crucifix forward. "In the name of Christ, depart," he commanded. Maria's eyes snapped open, blackened around the pupils, gleaming with a wet, unnatural shine. From her lips poured words in rapid succession, fragments of Latin, guttural syllables, and what I recognized as Old Castilian, but warped, archaic, as though spoken centuries ago. I strained to follow, my recorder whirring softly at my side. From among the babble, one phrase repeated again and again, "Nos fuimos enterrados, nos fuimos dejados." We were buried, we were left. The words struck me with a cold clarity. It was not a boast but a lament, the voice of something tied to the ground beneath Maria's home. Don Carlos did not pause. "You are not welcome. You are not master here. You will speak your name." Maria's body bucked, her restraints creaked, the chair legs lifting slightly from the floor as though some force pulled upward. She turned her head toward me, her lips curling in that grotesque smile. "You," the voice growled, layered and harsh. "You write, you listen. You carry me further with your ink. You are mine as well." I could not stop the chill that shot through me. My pen faltered in my hand. Yet Don Carlos's voice cut across the threat, sharp as a blade. "He is not yours. None here belong to you." He pressed the crucifix against Maria's chest. The reaction was immediate. Her scream filled the chapel, blood erupting from her nose in thin streams. Her head snapped back, and her jaw clenched so tightly that the sound of teeth grinding made me wince. For several minutes the struggle raged. Don Carlos's prayers, Maria's inhuman cries, the smell of something acrid, like burnt hair, filling the air. The candles flickered wildly, though there was no draught. At last, with a shudder that rippled through her entire frame, Maria collapsed forward. Her breathing was ragged, her body limp. Don Carlos stepped back, sweat glistening on his forehead, his chest heaving with exhaustion. But as he lowered the crucifix, Maria stirred again. Her eyes opened, soft, human, and for the first time in days, her voice, her own voice, broke through. "Padre," she whispered, weak but clear. "Help me, please." Tears welled in Antonio's eyes. He gripped Don Carlos's arm, his voice trembling. "She's there. She's still there." Don Carlos nodded slowly, his expression grave. "Yes, she fights, but so do they." He closed the ritual with deliberate care, his hand trembling slightly as he made the sign of the cross over her bowed head. "We will return tomorrow," he said firmly, "and we will not stop until the last voice is silenced." Yet as we left the chapel that day, I could not shake the echo of the words Maria, or what spoke through her, had addressed to me. "You carry me further with your ink." Even now, writing this, I wonder if they were right. The third session began under a sky heavy with storm clouds, though no rain yet fell. The town was restless. Whispers clung to every corner of Belmez. Some said the priests were losing, others that Maria had already died, and the church concealed it. The chapel, though small and hidden, had become the center of an invisible battle felt by all. When Maria was brought in, I barely recognized her. Her hair hung in tangled clumps, her lips cracked and raw. Yet it was her eyes that chilled me most. They darted rapidly, as if tracking movements unseen by the rest of us. She was bound again to the chair, the bruises of earlier restraint still visible across her wrists. Her sister stood in the back, pale and trembling, but insistent on remaining present. Antonio hovered close, silent, his faith clinging to Don Carlos's every gesture. The father began without hesitation. His voice was deeper this time, carrying a force that felt almost like defiance against the storm building outside. The first phrases of the ritual had barely begun when Maria's body jolted violently. Her head snapped forward, then back, the chair screeching against the stone floor. A guttural laugh burst from her throat. It was no single voice now. It was many, layered and discordant, like a choir singing in grotesque mockery. "You call us one," the chorus said through her lips. "We are many. We were fed. We were buried. We were never released." The air grew thick, pressing down on us like water in the lungs. The candles flared, their flames bending outward as if repelled by her. Don Carlos did not falter. "You have no place here. You will be cast out in the name of Christ." At that, Maria's head turned slowly toward her sister. Her lips curled, and the voices mocked. "We know you. We know your child, your sins whispered at night, your secret letters." The sister let out a sob and covered her face with her hands. Antonio gripped her shoulder, murmuring desperately, but the damage was done. The thing inside Maria thrived on the wound it had opened. Don Carlos's voice rose louder, drowning it out. The crucifix pressed firmly to her chest. Maria's screams split the air, shrill and piercing. Suddenly, the chair lurched violently sideways, toppling with such force that Antonio and I rushed forward instinctively to hold it upright. Even bound, her body thrashed with unnatural strength. Then it happened, a sound that froze us all. A loud crack, sharp as a whip, echoed from her jaw as it snapped open wider than human anatomy should allow. Her scream that followed was distorted, as though her throat were not her own. Blood trickled from the corners of her mouth, but the grin that followed was grotesque. "You cannot break what is buried in stone," the voice hissed, now singular sharp. "We were sealed by your kind, we were given to the earth, and now she carries us." Don Carlos's face darkened. For the first time I saw not just determination, but fury. He forced the crucifix against her forehead, his words like thunder. Adjuro te per deum vivum, per deum verum, per deum sanctum. Maria convulsed violently, her body arching until only her heels and head touched the ground, her back forming a grotesque bridge. Antonio gasped, his knuckles white where he held the chair steady. Then, with a violent shudder, she collapsed, gasping for breath. For several moments, the chapel was filled only with the sound of her ragged sobbing. When Don Carlos finally lowered the crucifix, sweat streaming down his face, he turned to us and spoke words that have haunted me since. "This is not possession alone," he said, his voice low. "This is infestation born of desecration. When we unearthed those nails and that hair, we did not uncover an evil. We disturbed its prison." I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing on my chest. "You mean it was sealed there deliberately?" He nodded grimly. "Long ago. Whoever buried it beneath her home meant to keep it contained, not destroyed. Now, it has breath again, and it will not release her easily." The session ended in silence, not triumph. Maria was carried to her cot, her sister following behind like a shadow. Don Carlos remained kneeling long after we had gone, his lips moving in silent prayer. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed the village streets, the sky roaring as though the heavens themselves bore witness. And as I walked back through the downpour, one thought would not leave me. If this was only the third session, what strength would be required for the battles still to come? The storm did not lift the following morning. Rain clung to Belmez as if the heavens themselves sought to wash the village clean, though no such cleansing came. The streets were slick, the air damp, and whispers carried more urgently. I could not escape the memory of Don Carlos's words. We disturbed its prison. They echoed with every thunderclap, heavy with implications that stretched far beyond one woman's suffering. When we gathered for the fourth session, there was a tension among us that felt different. Antonio spoke less, his eyes fixed on the floor. Maria's sister clutched her rosary as though it were the last thread of sanity she could hold. Don Carlos himself appeared gaunter, as if the ritual was carving away at him. Still, his voice remained steady when he commanded the beginning of prayers. Maria was brought in, her body limp but restless, twitching as though she dreamed even while awake. She muttered under her breath constantly, syllables that carried the rhythm of Latin but were twisted into something unrecognizable. When the first lines of the exorcism were spoken, her muttering ceased. Silence hung for a breath, and then, with a sharp inhalation, she sat upright, her eyes snapping open. This time, there was no laughter. Instead, her face contorted with something colder, sharper. She stared directly at Don Carlos, and the voice that spilled from her lips was quiet, deliberate. "Carlos Jimenez, son of Javier, you left your mother to die alone." The words struck like a stone. Don Carlos flinched, the first time I had seen him falter. His jaw clenched, his hand trembling only slightly as he raised the crucifix. "You will not speak of me," he growled, but Maria's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You prayed for her forgiveness too late. She died calling your name, and now you call upon a God who does not listen to you." The room grew frigid. The candles flickered violently, though no wind stirred. Antonio's eyes darted to the priest, waiting for him to answer, but Don Carlos only pressed the crucifix closer, his voice growing louder. "Adjuro te spiritus immunde per deum omnipotentem," Maria shrieked, her head snapping backward with such force we feared her neck might break. The scream devolved into a gurgling laugh. Then a second voice, deeper and guttural. "You cannot cast us out, priest. You carry your own chains. We will bind ourselves to them." At this, the chair shuddered violently beneath her. The ropes strained against her wrists and ankles, fibers snapping one by one. Antonio rushed to tighten them, but before he could reach, Maria's head whipped toward him. "You," the voice hissed, "you who begged God to save your father while he rotted. He heard you. He denied you." Antonio froze, his face draining of blood. His hands trembled as he slowly backed away, lips pressed shut as if afraid any word might confirm the entity's claim. I felt the walls themselves press closer. It was no longer simply tormenting Maria.
It was probing us, searching our wounds, feeding from them. Don Carlos, with renewed force, shouted above the storm of words, Dominus illuminatio mea et salus mea, quem timbo. The chapel vibrated with his prayer. For a moment, Maria's body slumped, her head hanging low. A faint hiss escaped her lips. But before relief could take hold, her body convulsed. She began speaking again, not in one voice, not in two, but in several, overlapping, each tone jagged and misaligned. They spoke not to the priest now, but to each of us in turn, to the sister. We know the child you lost, the one you buried without name. To me, you doubt, you write, you record, but you do not believe. You open the door for us with your unbelief. And then, back to Don Carlos. Your hands are stained. You confess to men, not to God. Your absolution is false. The words struck us like blows. Antonio crumbled to his knees, muttering prayers incoherently. The sister sobbed openly, clutching her rosary so tightly blood welled from her palm. And Don Carlos, he did not falter, though I saw in his eyes the shadow of torment. He continued the rite with a force that bordered on desperation. The crucifix pressed so hard against Maria's skin that it left a burn. Her scream rose again, but this time the sound was unnatural, deeper than her chest, resonating from somewhere within the stone floor itself. Sleep became impossible after that session. I lay in my small rented room above the baker's shop, the shutters drawn tight, yet I swore I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my door throughout the night. Whenever I rose to check, I found only silence and the faint smell of damp earth, as though the ground itself had been dragged indoors. The villagers noticed it too. Antonio did not return to his home after the ritual, but instead remained near the chapel, claiming the shadows in his house no longer matched his own movements. Maria's sister confessed she awoke to the sound of her dead child crying by the window. And Don Carlos, he arrived at morning mass looking as though he had aged 10 years overnight. His voice raw, his hands unsteady as he lifted the chalice. The entity's warning, "We are not inside her anymore, we are around you," had proven itself with chilling efficiency. Still, the work could not be abandoned. The bishop in Jaén had been informed of the circumstances, but gave no promise of intervention. Proceed cautiously, was all his letter advised. That meant the burden remained with Don Carlos, and with those of us who had borne witness to the earlier rites. When we gathered for the 5th session, the air was heavier than before, though Maria herself seemed almost calm. Her body bore the marks of struggle, bruises on her wrists, dark circles under her eyes. But her voice was soft when she greeted us. For the briefest moment, it was possible to believe the nightmare had ended. But Don Carlos would not let us settle into false comfort. "This is the most dangerous point," he warned. "When the spirit quiets, it is never because it has weakened, it is because it is preparing." The prayers began, steady and rhythmic. Maria lowered her head, her lips moving silently. I leaned closer, straining to hear, and felt the blood drain from my face. She was reciting the words in perfect unison with the priest, as though mocking him, her voice faint yet exact. Then she stopped. The silence was immediate, deliberate. Slowly she lifted her head and fixed her eyes on me. "You write everything," she whispered. "You think you are safe because you are not of this family. But ink does not protect you. Words invite us." My pen slipped from my hand. For a moment I considered leaving the chapel altogether,
But Don Carlos's voice cut through, louder now, commanding, as if to block out her words. Adjuro te omnis spiritus immunde, exi ab ea et noli amplius intrare in eam. Maria shrieked, her body convulsing so violently the chair rocked. Yet as her voice cracked, something new occurred, a sound not human, not from her at all. It came from beneath the floor, a rattling. The floorboards trembled faintly, dust rising in tiny clouds between the cracks. Antonio's face turned pale. The memory of what we had unearthed below, the coffin nails, the hair, the fragments of bone, was fresh in all our minds. Maria's scream turned into laughter. You dug too deep, you opened the earth, and what was buried no longer sleeps. At that moment, the crucifix in Don Carlos's hand grew hot enough that he dropped it with a hiss, shaking his palm as though burned. The silver clattered against the stone floor, echoing like a bell. The sister rushed forward instinctively, reaching to retrieve it. But before her fingers touched the metal, it skittered across the ground of its own accord, sliding several feet away. She recoiled with a cry, clutching her rosary until her knuckles whitened. The rattling beneath us grew stronger. I could swear the sound was that of nails scratching upward, as if something below clawed at the floor to be let in or out. Don Carlos shouted louder, his voice ragged but commanding. He retrieved the crucifix himself, pressing it back against Maria's chest. The stench of rot filled the air, sudden and overwhelming, forcing us to gag and cover our mouths. And then, silence. Maria slumped once more, her chest heaving, her eyes rolling back. The rattling ceased, the stench evaporated, leaving only the sound of our panicked breaths. The priest ended the session prematurely, sweat dripping from his brow. It is not only her anymore, he whispered. The ground itself is cursed, and if we fail, this village will carry it. That night I returned to my room, though sleep never came. At some hour past midnight, I heard scratching at my door, steady, deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. I gathered my courage and opened it. Nothing was there, only the corridor, still and empty. But when I looked down, I saw 3 long gouges cut deep into the wood of the doorframe, fresh and raw. The curse was no longer contained in the chapel, it was spreading. By the time the bells tolled on Sunday morning, the whole village had begun to whisper openly of what was happening. People spoke of shadows that moved against the light, of livestock refusing to enter their stalls, of sudden illnesses that left men trembling with fever by dawn, but perfectly recovered by dusk. The baker downstairs told me that during the night his ovens lit themselves, flames roaring so violently he feared the building would collapse. Yet when he fetched water to douse them, the fire vanished, leaving the stone cool to the touch. His hands shook as he recounted it to me, the whites of his eyes yellowed by sleeplessness. Belmez was suffocating under something unseen, and still the bishop refused to intervene. Don Carlos pressed forward with the 5th session, calling us back to the chapel, though the air itself seemed heavier with each step inside. Maria had been confined to the rectory by then, watched day and night, but even her guardians admitted that she sometimes disappeared from her bed. Once they found her kneeling in the sanctuary, her head bent backward, her lips moving soundlessly. Another time, she was discovered crouched in the cellar, her fingernails bloody from clawing the stone walls. When she was brought into the chapel for the next exorcism, she was smiling, not the vacant, delirious smile of madness, but deliberate, cruel. She looked directly at me and spoke with clarity. You still write. You still think this will end with pages. It will end with dirt, and you inside it. My hand trembled around the pen, yet I forced myself to keep recording. Don Carlos began the prayers, his voice more urgent than before. The crucifix in his hand shook, though his grip did not falter. The others knelt, their heads bowed low, though Antonio lifted his eyes often, as though waiting for something to strike from above. Almost at once, Maria's body stiffened. Her neck twisted unnaturally, her arms pulling at the restraints. Her lips moved, but not in words we recognized. A deep growl rumbled in her chest, layered with a second, higher voice that overlapped it. And then, all at once, every window in the chapel shattered inward. The sound was deafening, Glass sprayed across the pews. The sister screamed, clutching her arm where shards had cut into her flesh. I covered my head, my ears ringing from the impact. Wind howled through the broken frames, though outside, the storm had already passed. Maria laughed in the center of it all, her voice cutting through the chaos. This is not her body alone. This is the soil, the bones, the nails you uncovered. We are legion bound to this place. Don Carlos shouted over her, his Latin sharper than ever. Per Christum Dominum Nostrum, exi, et noli reverti. Her body convulsed, her teeth snapping together with such force we feared they would shatter, and then her eyes rolled back, leaving only the whites. At that same moment, Antonio collapsed to the floor. He was not touched, not struck, yet his body writhed as though invisible hands were holding him down. His mouth opened, but it was not his voice that poured out. Do not bind us. He belongs to us too. Don Carlos rushed to his side, pressing the crucifix to Antonio's forehead, commanding the spirit to leave. Antonio's scream tore through the chapel, and then he fell still, gasping, his face drenched with sweat. The silence that followed was unbearable. The broken windows let in a strange, cold light, though outside the sun had already risen. Dust floated in the air, shimmering as though alive. When the session finally ended, Don Carlos's strength seemed drained. His shoulders sagged, his hands trembled, yet his eyes burned with a resolve I had not seen before. This is no longer about one girl, he said, voice hoarse. The possession has grown roots. It feeds from the grave beneath the floor and the fear of all who witness it. If we cannot sever it, it will not stop here. The others stared at him in silence. No one doubted his words anymore. That night, reports spread that villagers had seen Maria walking the streets, though she was locked inside the rectory. They described her standing at crossroads, her head tilted at impossible angles, her mouth open in silent laughter. Yet when they checked the rectory, she had not moved from her bed. I knew then, the curse was no longer confined to flesh and bone. It had begun to wear the shape of illusions, to inhabit the air itself. And still, Don Carlos insisted, the next session must proceed. The day of the sixth session arrived under a sky without sun. Though morning had come, the village was shrouded in a dull grayness, as if the light itself hesitated to enter Belmez. People moved quickly in the streets, crossing themselves, whispering that they heard voices in the wind. When I entered the chapel, the stench struck first, faint but distinct, like damp soil and rotting hair. Don Carlos had already prepared the altar, placing candles in a tight circle around the chair where Maria would sit. His face was pale, his lips cracked from constant prayer. He did not greet me at once. Instead, he continued whispering to himself until the others arrived. Antonio came reluctantly, his eyes downcast. The sister walked beside him, her arm still bandaged from the cuts of the shattered glass. Each of us bore marks of the sessions already endured, though none so much as Maria. When she was brought in, something in me recoiled instantly. Her body had grown thinner, her cheeks hollow, yet her eyes burned with an intensity that was not her own. She smirked as Don Carlos began binding her to the chair. "You tire yourself, priest," she whispered. "Every prayer empties you. Soon you will have nothing left." Don Carlos ignored her, though I saw the flicker in his eyes. The prayers began. His voice rang through the chapel, strong though frayed with exhaustion. At first, Maria was still. Her lips trembled, muttering fragments that sounded like echoes of his Latin. Then, suddenly, her head snapped back, her body arching against the restraints. The first scream pierced like glass. It wasn't only sound, it was vibration, rattling the wood, the stone, the air itself. The candles flickered violently, though no draught touched them. "Exorcizo te, immundissim spiritus." Don Carlos pressed forward, lifting the crucifix. Maria laughed, but her laughter was interrupted by something worse. The sound of many voices speaking at once. Some were deep and guttural, others high-pitched, some whispering, some shouting, all pouring from her mouth in a cacophony that made my skin crawl. "We are in her. We are under her. We are beneath your feet," the voices chorused. At that, the floor shook. Dust and fragments of mortar rained from the ceiling. Antonio staggered backward, nearly falling. The rattling returned, louder now, unmistakable. It came from directly below the chapel floor, as though countless nails scraped the wood, demanding release. Don Carlos shouted louder, sweat dripping from his brow, his crucifix trembling as he pressed it to Maria's forehead. She screamed, a sound so sharp it seemed to split the air. Her body convulsed, her wrists bleeding against the ropes. The sister collapsed to her knees, sobbing, clutching her rosary. Antonio covered his ears, his face twisted in agony. I tried to keep my pen steady, but my hand trembled so badly the ink bled across the page. Then Maria's eyes snapped open, and they were no longer her eyes at all. They were black, glossy, like polished stone. "You cannot drive us away," the chorus of voices spat. "We were buried here long before your church. We are the covenant of the soil. The coffin nails, the hair, the blood, they bound us, you unbound us." Don Carlos shouted again, voice breaking but fierce, "Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus imperat." The crucifix burned against her skin, a blister rising instantly. The stench of scorched flesh filled the air. Maria howled, her head thrashing violently. Suddenly every candle went out at once. Darkness swallowed the chapel, so complete I could not see my own hand. And then an attack. Something unseen struck Antonio across the face, throwing him to the floor. He screamed, clutching his cheek, blood seeping between his fingers. The sister was dragged backward by her hair, pulled several feet before Antonio scrambled to her aid. I myself felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, pressing down with crushing force. Don Carlos's voice was the only light in that void, his words cutting through the chaos, shouted with such ferocity that they seemed to summon flame back to the candles. One by one the lights flared, revealing the chapel once more. Maria slumped forward, limp, smoke rising faintly from the mark on her forehead where the crucifix had pressed. Her chest heaved, her breathing ragged. Don Carlos lowered the crucifix, his hand trembling violently. His eyes were wet, though whether from sweat, tears, or both I could not tell. "We are fighting not only for her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We are fighting for the land itself, and the land does not wish to be freed." Silence lingered after he spoke, heavy, suffocating. We knew the sessions were tearing at more than Maria's body. They were tearing at the roots of Belmez itself. And yet he said the next would be the most dangerous. The next morning, the village felt like a place waiting for its own funeral. Doors remained shut, shutters closed, and not even the usual barking of dogs echoed through the streets. The baker's shop below my room never opened. When I knocked, no one answered. It was as though Belmez itself was holding its breath. Don Carlos summoned us to the rectory before nightfall. His face was drawn, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion. He carried no books, no relics apart from the crucifix, and when he spoke his voice was steady but grim. "We cannot delay. The entity grows stronger with every hour. Tonight we attempt the final expulsion. If we fail, it will not stop at Maria. It will not stop at this chapel. It will take the whole village." He looked at each of us in turn. Antonio nodded, though his lips trembled. The sister clutched her rosary to her chest, silent but resolute. As for me, I wanted to protest, to step back, to leave this cursed ground behind. Yet I found my own voice betraying me with a single word: yes. By the time we entered the chapel, night had fallen. The windows remained shattered from before, letting the cold air sweep across the pews. Don Carlos placed Maria in the chair once more, binding her carefully. She did not resist. She sat still, watching us with unnerving calm, her lips curled into a faint smile. "You think this will end," she whispered, "but it has already begun." The ritual started. Don Carlos's voice filled the chapel, stronger than I expected, resonant, almost defiant. His words rolled through the nave, each line striking like a hammer against the silence. At first, Maria remained quiet. Her chest rose and fell, her head bowed. But then slowly, her body began to tremble. Her lips parted. The sound that poured out was not a scream, nor a laugh, but something stranger, chanting. Layered voices, dozens at once, speaking in unison in a language I could not place. The sound echoed not only in the air, but in the stone beneath us, as if the ground itself repeated the words. And then the floor shifted. At first it was subtle, a tremor like a distant quake. Dust fell from the rafters. The pews creaked. But within seconds, the shaking grew violent. Cracks split the floorboards at Maria's feet, and from within those cracks rose the unmistakable smell of rot. Antonio shouted, pointing, and I saw them. Coffin nails, rusted and black, pushing up through the wood as though spat from the earth. Hair followed, matted and grey, tangled with dirt. The sister screamed. I clutched my notebook to my chest, unable to move. Maria's head snapped up. Her eyes were black voids once more, and her mouth twisted in an inhuman grin. "You unearthed us!" the layered voices boomed through her. "Now we rise!" The crucifix in Don Carlos's hand glowed faintly in the candlelight. He thrust it forward, shouting louder than I had ever heard him, "Exorcizo vos, omnis spiritus immundi, per Deum vivum, per Deum verum, per Deum sanctum." The floorboards groaned violently. The nails rattled like teeth. Hair slithered across the ground like serpents. The stench of decay grew unbearable, thick, suffocating. Then it struck. An unseen force swept through the chapel, hurling Antonio backward into a pew. Wood splintered on impact, and he crumpled to the floor, dazed but breathing. The sister was lifted from her knees and thrown against the wall, her rosary shattering into beads that scattered across the stone. I myself felt a crushing weight press me to the ground, pinning me. My chest ached, my lungs gasped for air, as if the earth itself pressed down to bury me alive. Only Don Carlos remained standing. His eyes burned with something I had not seen before, not merely faith but fury. He stepped closer to Maria, pressing the crucifix against her brow. Smoke rose, the smell of burnt flesh filling the air. She shrieked, her voice splitting into countless tones, each one writhing like serpents in the dark. "You cannot cast us out, priest," the voices thundered. "You are guilty. You are ours." And then the words changed. The voices began to chant his sins aloud, detail by detail, his failures, his doubts, his unconfessed shames. They poured from Maria's mouth with surgical cruelty. Don Carlos staggered, his lips trembling. For a moment I thought he would break. But then he screamed, not at the voices, not at Maria, but at himself. "I am a sinner, I am unworthy, but Christ alone is my salvation." The crucifix blazed, not with flame, not with light, but with a presence, a pressure that filled the room, forcing the air to vibrate. The coffin nails quivered, the hair writhed and recoiled. Maria convulsed violently, foam gathering at her mouth. And then she spoke again, but this time only one voice remained. Cold, final. "If you cast us out, priest, where shall we go?" The chapel fell silent, save for the sound of her rasping breath. Don Carlos's face was pale, but his voice did not falter. "Back to the earth, to the place you came from, and may God bind you there." At those words the floor split wider, and from the dark below rose a wind carrying the reek of centuries-old decay. The candles guttered, nearly extinguishing. Maria's scream tore through the chapel, so loud it seemed to shake the bones of the building itself. And then, silence. She slumped forward, unconscious. The nails receded, the hair withered into dust. The cracks in the floor closed, leaving only scars of splintered wood. Don Carlos fell to his knees, the crucifix slipping from his hand. The session had ended, but as I looked at Maria's still body, I knew the question was not whether she had been freed, but what price had been paid to silence the voices, and whether the earth itself would remain quiet. When dawn finally broke over Belmez, the village appeared ordinary once more. The streets were quiet, the air crisp, and for the first time in weeks, the birdsong returned. Yet there was an unnatural stillness, as though the earth itself had been asked to hold its breath. Maria lay in her bed at the rectory, exhausted, pale, her body trembling but free of the convulsions that had racked her for so long. She whispered only occasionally, speaking in her own voice, her memories of the possession fragmented and distant. Her sister remained by her side, guarding her as if the nightmares of the past weeks might return at any moment. Don Carlos moved among us, silent, his face drawn. He would not eat. would not sleep. He went to the chapel to inspect the floor himself, checking the boards, tapping the stone below. He found nothing, no nails, no hair, nothing. But when he looked into the air, his gaze lingered on shadows that seemed to bend just slightly out of place, and I saw a flicker of unease pass over his face. The village slowly began to stir. People left their homes, murmuring thanks, though none dared enter the chapel for fear of disturbing whatever had been fought there. Some whispered that they had seen Maria walking in the fields before dawn, but she could not recall leaving her bed. Others claimed to hear whispers in the wind, voices repeating prayers and curses intertwined, though no one could be sure if it was memory or imagination. I met Don Carlos privately in the chapel that evening. He allowed me to speak with him, though his eyes never left the floor. "You have seen what was beneath that house," he said, voice low, almost broken. "You know what it took to silence it. But understand this, it is not gone. We returned it to the earth, yes, but the earth remembers, and the nails, the hair, the remnants of the life that was buried, they carry memory. It waits in silence." I shivered, realizing that the calm of the morning was merely a veneer. "And the girl?" I asked. "She is free," Don Carlos replied, "but freedom is fragile. One crack in faith, one disturbance, and it will rise again." I left Belmez that day, my notebook heavy with the record of everything I had witnessed. The streets were quiet, the sun low in the sky, and yet I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. Weeks later I returned to my own town and began writing the account of what had occurred. Each word felt heavy, as though the ink carried weight beyond paper. Yet the memory of the final session haunted me most. Maria's final scream, the floor splitting, the smell of centuries-old decay. And then, months later, I received a letter. There was no return address. Inside was a single note written in jagged handwriting I did not recognize. "You recorded everything. You told the world. But what rises from the earth does not forget. Beware the floors you walk upon. Beware the soil you disturb. We are patient. We are silent. We wait." I looked up from the letter, my hands trembling. Outside, the wind rustled across the streets, and though the houses were solid, the ground beneath them familiar. I felt it, a presence just beneath the surface, patient, waiting. The Belmez house had been quiet, but the horror it concealed beneath its floorboards had not been destroyed, only silenced. And I knew in my bones that silence was never permanent. The case remains one of the scariest, most unnerving I have ever encountered. A house in Belmez, buried nails, human hair, a girl possessed, and the earth itself complicit in the horror. It is a story of faith, fear, and the knowledge that some things should never be unearthed, because what sleeps beneath the ground does not forgive, and it does not forget. The question that lingers as I write this in the safety of my office is simple and terrifying. When the ground remembers, who will be next? After weeks of observation, interviews, and first-hand experience of the exorcism sessions conducted by Don Carlos, I close this file with the full weight of what was witnessed. The events at the Belmez house remain, without doubt, among the most terrifying I have ever recorded. Maria, the young woman at the center of this possession, survived the ordeal, though she carries scars both visible and unseen. The manifestations, convulsions, multi-layered voices, and the physical disturbances tied to the very ground beneath her home cannot be explained by conventional medicine, psychology, or science. Coffin nails, human hair, and remnants of past rituals suggest a deliberate entombment of a malevolent force, one that thrived on disruption and exposure. Don Carlos, whose experience guided this investigation, attests that the evil was not merely within Maria's body, but embedded in the soil itself, lying dormant until disturbed. Witnesses, including myself, were left with a profound sense that the threat persists, patient, silent, and capable of extending beyond the house. As I compile these notes, I find that the case continues to unsettle me. The quiet moments, the ordinary streets of Belmez, even the soil beneath my own feet now seem charged with the memory of what transpired. The weight of what was unearthed is not merely physical, it is psychological, spiritual, and deeply disturbing.
This file is closed, but the questions remain. How many forces lie buried, waiting for discovery? And how far does the influence of what sleeps beneath the ground truly reach? End of case file. Belmez, Spain, 1971.